Welcome, everyone. This is the third in our briefing series where we're bringing together climate and energy researchers with journalists and others who are writing about climate and energy issues in the context of these broader debates that we're seeing at the moment. Welcome back to any of you who joined us for our previous briefings. These briefings are intended to be relatively informal sessions, giving us the chance to hear what the experts are thinking that we should be discussing in the context of the events that are unfolding right now. It gives them a chance to tell us what they think we need to know and for us to ask a range of questions. I'm Lucy Richardson and I'm the Deputy Director at Monash's Climate Communication Hub. Today, we're bringing everyone together to stress test Australia's energy system. And we have with us Associate Professor Stuart Walsh from Civil and Environmental Engineering in the Faculty of Engineering at Monash University, and Associate Professor Andrew Rendell from the Energy Impact Lab and Department of Economics in Monash's Business School. We will put up a slide at the end with their titles and contact details in case you want to reach out to them and follow up with either of them after the briefing. To get us started though, I'm going to ask Stuart and Andrew to introduce themselves, letting you know a bit about their expertise relevant to today's discussions, and to spend a few minutes giving you their insights on the key things that we need to be thinking about right now from their perspective. Then we'll open up for questions. We are recording the session and the recording will be available up online as soon as we can on the Hub's website. Okay, let's start with you, Stuart.
Thanks very much, Lucy. My name's Stuart Walsh. I'm a member of the Resources Engineering Group and the founder of the Monash Industrial Decarbonisation Group. I've been working on energy research for around about 20 years now. My focus these days is looking at economic opportunities for Australia through the energy transition. And I guess in the wake of this latest energy crisis, one of the things that struck me is just how much emphasis there's been around trying to restart a sovereign petroleum industry within Australia, so specifically around refining oil and making our own petrol. Unfortunately, while that might sound like a bit of a nice idea, I think it ignores a couple of big structural problems. Firstly, there are some big barriers to us actually finding enough oil and also producing enough new refining capacity in Australia to meet our domestic needs. And secondly, even if we're successful in establishing these things, I think it's debatable whether or not this will be sufficient to protect us from fuel shocks in the future. Lucy, would you like me to go on more, or maybe I should pass over to Andrew right now?
Let's pass over to Andrew. Yeah.
Cheers.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Stuart. So I like Stuart, have about 2 decades of experience in the energy sector. My background's a little bit different than the other academics that you might see at these briefings. So I come from an industry background. So I'm actually an associate professor of practice in the energy lab and the economics department, meaning that most of my experience comes from the private sector. So I started in litigation economics in the United States, which was primarily about doing work related to expropriation claims, for example, when Venezuela took over Chevron's assets in the early noughties. I then moved to Europe and worked on similar work throughout Africa, South America, and then finally came to Australia about 10 years ago, worked at CSIRO, then was the chief economist at the Essential Services Commission of Victoria, before a short stint at Rio Tinto and coming to Monash. But all of the work I did was, high-level economic research in the energy sector, in oil and gas mining and that sort of thing. So most of that work was related to policy development for governments, and I think that's really relevant now, because the main point I would make is that prices are signals, and prices contain a lot of information that are useful in terms of formulating policy. And to the extent we want to change prices, to the extent we don't like prices, that can be really dangerous if we try to do that. And I have a number of, sort of subpoints around this that ultimately come down to 2 big policy interventions that I'd like to see, that I think if we're brave enough in Australia, we should make and could make. And those 2 policy interventions, I won't leave you on tender hooks with those policies. Those 2 big policies would be centralizing support for in-need households rather than trying to change individual sectors and goods in those markets for our needs. And then the other one is the obvious one that they've been talking about for 4 decades since I was a little kid. The fact that we still haven't implemented a carbon tax is still, somewhat embarrassing. And I think this is the real, opportunity that we have here. So with that, Lucy, yeah, maybe I'll hand it back to you and we can get into the finer points.
Great, thank you very much. All right, I'll open up now for questions. If you could just use the Zoom feature to raise your digital hand, and when I do call you, I'll get you to introduce yourselves when you ask your question. So let's see who has some questions. June.
Hi, I'm June from Daily Straits. Anyway, I just have a question for anyone here. Do you think if this actually goes ahead, will there be a possibility of Australia going through a reverse migration where people actually leave and go back to their home countries because it's just too expensive to continue staying here? Thank you.
I guess I can answer that one. One of the things I think we should recognize is that while energy prices have spiked in Australia and petrol prices have spiked in Australia, our petrol prices are still comparatively low compared to lots of other places around the world. So maybe you might go back to your home country based on that, but you might find extremely high prices internationally as well. So I'm afraid there's no escaping the current price spike. We've just got to work out ways that we can adapt to it and move on from it, I think.
I think Stuart's absolutely right there. And I would even follow up and say that as a percentage of income, Australians are probably better off than a lot of countries where we see a lot of migration to Australia from. So even in Western Europe, so currently I'm in Switzerland. Full disclosure, I'm on sabbatical. Joining this call, and in Western Europe, there's a lot of hand waving around. What's going to happen here because it's a much larger percentage of income that energy prices are being shocked towards. And so this is a bigger issue actually in a lot of other countries, even compared to Australia. So yes, it could be that some people are forced to go back for other reasons, but I don't think it's specifically going to be because of energy costs.
Mm.
Chris.
Hi, thanks to all of you for putting on today. Karis Palmer from The Energy. I just had a question about, in the absence of a carbon tax, whether you think there's a case to be made for an increasing tax on gas profits.
You're thinking something like super profit taxes or something
Yeah,
like
I mean,
this?
not the tax that's currently kind of being discussed in the Senate inquiry that the Greens have kind of proposed, as opposed to a sort of polluter pays levy, which is obviously quite different to that. So, yeah.
Right. So there's various formulations of this. I actually worked on the super tax on resource rents about a decade and a half ago in Australia. And I think in general, I'm against these super resource rent taxes. One, because unless they're put up ex ante, where expectations are set before you enter into a contract, then it's sort of looking like a knee-jerk reaction. And I think that's bad for setting expectations on investors' investments. And so I would be against that in general. And I think high prices in general are a good thing to have in the market now, because it will signal to the market where to invest. And it also will be good for other substitutes, right? So when prices rise, we get this substitute effect, and we see a lot of substitute effects in the electrification of industry and transport, etc. So to the extent you want to blunt that signal, you want to bring down prices, you're effectively saying, well, I don't want the economy to be forced into substitute energy sources. And so I also have this issue with the super resource rent taxes, these super taxes, because one, they're going to be short term, right? So we don't know how long this elevated price spike is going to last. To the extent it's short and sharp, I think that could be good for industry. It could be good for investors. People saying that these are acts of God are probably having a hard time of it right now, because there's a second shock in just 5 years. So maybe this is something that needs to be built into investors' expectations, and that will actually encourage a lot of diversification away from fuel sources, and and also country sources, single country sources. I think it's also important to say that every system of fuel and energy can have shocks. It's not like we can escape that by just going to electrification, right? You could have a single power plant and that could have a big outage. You could have multiple different fuels, etc. So diversification is key to building resilience, and electrification is a good way of doing that, right? Because you have all of these atomized sources with rooftop solar, et cetera, et cetera. But every system is susceptible to shocks. And just saying, look, we think these people have an asset, which is fuel, and that it should be taxed now because it's valuable. That's suspicious, right? That's not the right way of doing it necessarily.
Thank you.
We have a question that was pre-submitted, so I'll just put this one forward. To date, the renewables debate has largely been shaped as an either-or proposition. For example, solar, wind, hydro will become the dominant forms of energy generation as the transition progresses. But the current fuel crisis has highlighted that while we can upgrade and transition energy generation, there are far too many consumption points for fuel, diesel in particular, trucks, cars, ships, industrial equipment, etc., to completely phase it out. As Australia recovers from the initial shock of the Iran conflict, how can we reconcile the desire for a renewable transition with the inevitability of continued diesel demand? What policy settings should we tweak, and what level of indefinite fossil fuel consumption will we just have to accept as inevitable for the coming decades?
Well, I think I'll add my 2 cents for that, and then maybe Andrew can to follow up. Um, I think that if we're thinking about diesel consumption in particular, what we're currently seeing is an incentive for us to start thinking about alternatives. And I think the challenge going forward is that we're going to have the supply chain shock right now. It's going to drive and has driven the price of diesel way up. We don't know how long it's going to last for at that price point, but there's every possibility that it'll come crashing down again in the future and then possibly come crashing back up again. There's a significant amount of uncertainty around how we can plan for that, or any business can plan for that. What we have to our advantage these days is there are alternatives that we didn't have even 10 years ago to our consumption of diesel and other petroleum products as well. We've got the ability to decarbonize processes in mining. We've got alternative sources for energy and alternative sources for electricity, even in some very remote mine sites. Also through transportation, we've got options now for more electrification, and they're becoming increasingly competitive, especially now with the prices of diesel going up as high as they have. So what I think we'll see is just naturally a transition away from a lot of the demand that we've historically had for diesel onto some of what is now becoming cheaper sources of energy for supplying things like transportation and off-grid power that we tend to use diesel for in Australia. I think the one thing that these shocks do is they act as this kind of ratcheting mechanism where people will transition for whatever reason, but once they do, they won't necessarily go back. And then that's going to have a flow-on effect to demand for diesel and demand for other petroleum products going into the future. Now, unfortunately, I think what that means in the long run is that these shocks will become more frequent as a result. And so there's kind of a feedback effect between fluctuations in prices, people shifting their sources of demand to more fluctuations in prices in the future. And I think regardless of whatever policies we put in place, they should be around recognizing the fact that it's not going to be a straight road ahead in terms of an easy or predictable price for a lot of these fossil fuels that we've relied on in the past. And we need to think about ways that we can reduce our reliance on these things going forward. One of the things that struck me is in preparation for this and other meetings I've had recently, I've been going back and looking at some of the talk around fuel economy standards going back to the 1980s. And we constantly talk about how we should get more fuel efficient vehicles and how we should have a more fuel efficient system. And yet we've done remarkably little in terms of the actual practice of how fuel efficient our fleets are within the Australian economy, especially if you compare it to something like Europe, where their fuel economy is substantially better than ours. I'm not so sure that fuel economy standards are necessarily the way forward. I think actually these days, for many areas, especially personal transportation, just going into electric is the way to go forward if we want to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. But introducing fuel economy standards in other areas might also be a way to go too. Maybe we should be thinking about how we can insulate the Australian economy from future fuel shocks by thinking about implementing maybe new taxes on diesel because we don't want to become dependent on these external fuel sources. Maybe we should be thinking about how we can discourage this reliance on this volatile and unreliable form of energy.
I think that's exactly what an economist would say. I think, Stuart, maybe you're an economist at heart. I think generally speaking, what we want to do is not shield ourselves from prices. We want to take those prices as they change and understand what information they're providing. And when prices increase, that means that the constraint, the supply constraint, is more binding, right? So if there's a price on something, that means there's a constraint. So one thing that sort of boggles my mind is that people talk about the new constraint that we have here. Well, if there's a price on it, we've always had a constraint on it. And now it's just telling us with a higher price that we've got more constraints on it. And so people should build that into their expectations, and then they would probably start looking at alternatives like electrification that Stuart's talking about, and alternatives in terms of being more resilient to external shocks. So I think, again, we come back to this idea that prices are really important and they're saying something important to us, and we should be listening to them rather than trying to push them away or to tap them down or to blunt that signal.
So another thought, another consideration, do you think that there is the potential for energy security to shift away from alliance-based systems to more national self-sufficiency? We did get a bit of a mention earlier. And what sorts of conditions do you think would actually lead to that outcome?
Maybe I was mentioning before that I was looking at what it would take for us to become more self-sufficient within Australia. And to be honest, I'm very cynical about it. So maybe take what I have to say with a grain of salt. The truth of the matter is that Australia has a lot of fantastic energy resources. We've got vast amounts of coal, we've got vast amounts of uranium, we've got vast amounts of wind, solar, natural gas. We're incredibly blessed in terms of the energy that we have within this continent. There's just one thing we lack in spades, and that is oil. Um, we had, we were, I would say, very fortunate in being able to find large oil deposits in like the Gippsland Basin and also later in the Carnarvon Basin. And we went out, we explored for those resources. We found them, around the 1960s and started developing them through in the 1980s with the Gippsland Basin, and then the Carnarvon was the 1990s. But they're not infinite. And in fact, both of those resources we've essentially, well, definitely with the Gippsland Basin, we've used it up or getting very close to using it up. In terms of our current production of oil and gas, we produce, oh, not gas, but oil. We produce enough oil to satisfy maybe a quarter of our needs for oil within Australia, or for petroleum products within Australia anyway. Uh, and the problem is even the oil that we do produce in Australia, we don't actually turn it into products in Australia, at least most of it. We ship it off overseas, not for any nefarious reason, but just because it happens to be that we found that oil closer to Singapore than we did closer to our refining centres on the East Coast. So if we want to become more energy independent, then we need to go out and somehow secure out for ourselves about 3 times as much oil as we currently have. I don't really see that happening because people have been looking for a long time for new supplies of oil and not really finding any great cheap sources that are out there. And then we also need to go out and we need to build maybe another 6 refineries. And I also don't see that happening because our current refineries, we still have to subsidize them to keep them going. So there's not great prospects there either. Um, so then, even if we do all of that, then at current rates of production, we're currently got maybe another 12 years in terms of our rates of production for how much oil that we currently know about in our reserves. That's not a lot, and it'd be a whole heap of effort to go out and swap our economy over. And at the same time, oil is an incredibly valuable resource. It's not just used for petrol, it's used to make a whole bunch of other things. Um, it might be something that we want to preserve going into the future because we might need it to make plastics and other things in the future in different ways with the new technologies that come along rather than burning it right now. So with all of those things in mind, I think maybe we should be thinking about looking for alternatives to oil and petrol for our future energy security, because even if we produce as much as I said we're going to produce, it still doesn't buy us that much time. The other thing that it fails to do is it fails to protect us from shocks. We think that having our own internal production gives us some shield against price shocks, and it might give you a little bit of a shock. Look at the United States right now. But to be honest, I went back and I checked like some of the different times at which we've had petrol rationing in Australia. Because I heard on the radio that the last time we had petrol rationing was in 1979. And my wife and I could both remember being in a time of petrol rationing, but we weren't we're old, but we're not that old. We can remember 1979. Let's put it that way. Um, and the truth of the matter is, we've had petrol supply shocks in Australia. I think we had some in not obviously 1979, 1981. I think we had one. We had some in 1990, and then 2001 as well. And all of these different supply shocks, they were just local ones. They were in Victoria or New South Wales and Victoria or Adelaide, and they were caused by either maintenance issues, breakdowns, or industrial action. Even if we have our own internal supplies, it doesn't shield us from supply shocks. It just shifts the risk around. And so I think coming back to what Andrew was saying before, what we need to do is thinking about diversifying our supply chains, not relying on this one very finite resource, which is very, very valuable. Let's be clear here. We don't want to be digging this stuff up and burning it for no reason. We want to be turning it into more valuable products in the future. And so, if we want to go energy independent, we need to start thinking about becoming less dependent on these finite resources and thinking about more renewable resources as a way to go into the future.
Yeah, I think Stuart hit every point I would probably make, and I think I just reiterate one point, which is that look, it's trying to find alternatives, substitutes at what cost. So yes, absolutely, Australia could go it alone, could do everything it needs to do, but at what cost? And it could be extreme. It could be extreme. And that's one because of our specific mix of local resources, as Stuart already pointed out. You know, oil is one thing that we don't necessarily have a huge amount of, and the resources that we have got, we've actually exploited to a great extent already in some sense. And the other thing is, when we look at international oil refining costs, they're all substantially lower than what we've been able to do in Australia. And so if we care about price, if we care about energy poverty in Australia, then we probably don't want to, have this overcapacity built in Australia that allows us to absorb shocks. And even then, at the very end of the day, Stuart hit the right point here as well, which is it doesn't necessarily mean that we're bulletproof, right? Every system is going to be subjected to shocks somewhere and somehow. And so the way to get around that is to deal with the resilience problem by atomizing the source. And energy in electrification is probably one of the best ways of doing that, rather than saying, let's put up a big new field here with pipelines and then a refinery, etc. I think there's a lot of good case studies where countries have tried that. Zambia is the country I worked in where they built their own refinery, and it was constantly subjected to shocks domestically because the refinery wasn't quite reliable. So we could be in that same situation, and it would be very costly. And I think we just need to realize that there's trade-offs when we try to go down these paths.
June, you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to follow up to what Prof. Stewart said. So it's very interesting that you said that we shouldn't rely too much on energy. However, most Australians or everyone who lives here has a car that uses petrol and stuff like that. So do you think the government should give some kind of grant or something to entice them to go electric? Because that's probably going to help in the future whenever there's another shock like this. If people are not too reliant on petrol, it won't be such a detrimental situation. So it's quite expensive to make the switch from petrol car to electric car. I feel that's the number one reason a lot of people are panicking right now.
Yep.
And then the second one, if I may, maybe I pass this to Dr. Professor Andrew. What do you think of Prime Minister Albanese doing a tour with Southeast Asian countries and getting reassurance about fuel supply? Is it too little, too late, or is it something that they need to do moving forward? Since it's it's kind of like a volatile situation which has no end date. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to speak directly to policy matters around how we should incentivize swaps to electric vehicles, but I think it's one of those things where definitely I think government policy should be aimed at driving or reducing our reliance on external sources of energy as much as we possibly can, because we want to have a more resilient nation. We want to have something that's more self-dependent if we can. And if we can find government policies that push us towards a more resilient and, frankly, in the long run, often a less costly way of life, then that's a good thing. I think there are policies that we can probably enact, and or at least sectors we can probably target. I know there are certain road users that use their vehicles and drive more than other people, and maybe we can help incentivize them to swap across to electric. I'm thinking of all of the Uber drivers and the other Lyft drivers and all of those other sorts of groups that are out there. But to be honest, if you speak to the Uber drivers and Lyft drivers and other groups that are out there driving electric vehicles around at the moment, they're really happy that they made the switch because, well, they're not paying for the fuel right now, for one. And for two, they don't have as much cost in terms of maintenance for their vehicles as well. So many of them are already making the switch because it's a more intelligent switch in the longer run anyway. And I think this will just help those things. But my research isn't really about these sorts of policies, so I'll refrain from commenting more on that.
I think we already see that electric vehicles are around parity with liquid fuels in many situations. I'd be surprised if we need to give it another push with subsidies. With subsidies or any policy intervention, you have to first identify what the market failure is or what the objective is that you're trying to induce. And here we're trying to get people to think in the longer term around what types of vehicles do they want to buy as we slowly change out their fleet, right? So I think having a higher price automatically makes people think, okay, well, let me look at the alternatives. And I think that's already happening. I don't think there needs to be a subsidy to do that. I think people will already do that calculation. And as these price spikes become more frequent, I mean, we've had 2 big price spikes in the last 5 years, people will start building that into their expectations and actually moving forward with higher price levels in mind. Even if price levels at the purchase date are lower, they'll still think, well, prices can spike. We can be exposed to higher prices. So no, I'd be surprised if we need that additional push with a subsidy.
I actually have a question for
Um,
you, Andrew, if that's all right, around that topic. What do you think about like subsidies or government intervention in infrastructure supporting electric vehicles and transportation? Specifically, I know we've been talking about charging a lot, but what about like trucks and buses and those sorts of things? Do you think that's required?
yes, yes. So I think there it's a cleaner argument, because what you're trying to do with those sorts of targeted interventions in infrastructure are basically solve a coordination problem. So the coordination problem there is that, well, we don't have enough traffic, we don't have enough volume to justify the economic investment of this infrastructure. So the government might step in and say, look, we want to solve this coordination problem. We'll take the first mover response here and invest in the infrastructure, and maybe we'll sell off that asset at some later date to the private sector. So maybe there isn't a huge subsidy at the end, and that will spur people to have more confidence in electrifying, right? Because the infrastructure will be in place. It's the chicken and egg thing, and so government can solve those sorts of problems. That's a very clear intervention strategy, right? We're solving a market failure in a way that is this coordination problem. But when it comes to things where individuals are just making a choice about their consumption bundle, about whether to go electric or stay with their diesel ute, that's not a coordination problem, and that's more about expectations in the future and looking at your constraint right now. And so all of that is information that they have, and I think, as you rightly pointed out, people are already making that switch. And I even think that, looking today or just before the the most recent energy shock, electric vehicles were already undercutting a lot of liquid fuel vehicles for a lot of majority of users, especially in the urban areas. So yes, if there's a coordination problem, if there's a market failure that we can identify, yes, government go in there, right? But I will caveat that with one thing, which is government policy is a risk in and of itself. And more of the sort of weighted average cost of capital work that we're doing is including pretty large premiums on government policy. And that's because we just don't know what government policy is going to do. It changes quite frequently, right? Even in Australia. And this can cause a lot of angst with investors. And so I think that's another thing, is that we shouldn't be doing knee-jerk reactions here. We should be having a standard policy that we always sing to, and then reduce that government policy uncertainty as well. I think there was a second part to that question, which was, is it too late, too little too late, going around the region to our strategic partners, energy partners, and trying to shore up and sort of provide a foundation for supply. Look, I don't know any of the specifics, nor would I want to comment about the specifics of policy. But look, I think a lot of those refineries and a lot of those sort of international relationships that we have are contractually obligated. And so if there is a true supply crunch, then those things would have to be renegotiated. And usually that's not going to be the government that negotiates. It's going to be the counterparties that negotiate on that. And then it's just going to be a matter of price again. That probably dictates what we receive. And I don't think there's a political element to that at the end of the day. In those negotiations, it's going to be just dollars and cents. It'll be the finance side of things that dictate it.
Just building on that then, how competitive is Australia in securing those supplies in a constrained global market?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think, generally speaking, Australia has a pretty high willingness to pay for fuels. We are an export-led country where energy is a big part of basically everything we do here. By the way, energy is a big component of basically everything in the world, right? Energy is wealth, basically, however you're going to get it. And so I think Australia has a high willingness to pay, and I think we could pay substantial prices to get the energy that we need. I sort of don't know whether we'll actually get to that point, right? So most of these energy products are fungible. They're basically priced in the global market. So I think we're right up there in terms of being competitive for what is available. Obviously, if the constraint goes low enough and everyone is really scrambling for their own resources, then we could be in a bigger problem, right? But we're not there yet. I suspect Stuart has probably a significant amount to say about.
All I was going to add to that would be that the one place where Australia is sort of there is a risk to Australia is in the supply, not so much in going around to different countries and securing additional supply, but guaranteeing that if that petrol that you've bought from Singapore, if you've bought it at a particular price, it's not going to suddenly crash down through the floor by the time it gets to Australia. I think particularly in the early days of, well, I say early days, we are barely at the start of this thing, I think, and it's going to be a while to go. But at the start of this particular crisis, I think we had supply shortages that were predominantly, in part, I won't say predominantly, they were in part driven by the fact that people were unsure if they bought these products at a particular price by the time it got to Australia, whether or not the diesel price would crash through the floor and you wouldn't be able to make your money back. And the fact that the government is stepping in to provide some sort of quasi-insurance around that, some surety around your ability to get that price back, I think is a very good thing, especially because of the extreme volatility that's going on. I mean, with every new announcement that's coming out of the Middle East, we see the price of oil rocket up and then shoot down and rocket up and shoot down. And maybe that timing is good for the US market, but it kind of sucks for us on Monday morning because it's still the weekend over in the United States. So I think we're copping it a little bit because of that. Yeah, this ability to reduce that risk for seaborne or tankers that are coming our way, I think that means that people have a little bit more confidence in being able to buy and make money off those tankers as they get in. I think many of these things are really about trying to work out what the new normal is going to look like as well. I think prices are going to be more expensive. We don't know if they're going to be as expensive as they were in the 1979 crisis, or if they're going to be as expensive as they were at the peak of the prices in sort of around the late 2000s. At the moment, what's striking to me is that WTI, in terms of inflation adjusted prices, is still way lower than what we were paying for it in sort of 2006, 2007, 2008. So we still have a ways to go before we get up to those peaks. What is scary about the current situation is the speed and the uncertainty around it. It has been rocketing up a lot faster than any supply crunches that we've had in the past. And we don't know what will happen in the future, whether it will come rocketing down just as fast or whether it will stay at those levels. I think this is kind of a missing question that no one's really been talking about. Not so much the high prices, but the uncertainty about what will happen in the future and what that means for investment and changes. If we had some surety that these prices were going to remain at this level, then we would adapt. Because, well, we have in the past. I can see inflated adjusted prices in front of me right now, and we've lived with these prices before, not that long ago. But what I think makes everyone on their edge is the fact that it seems like they could go much higher, and we don't yet know if they'll go much higher, say at the same level, or drop down, or whatever, what period of time that will happen. And I think that in and of itself actually constricts supply more than a lot of other things too. But I don't have a policy solution for that. That's for sure.
Stuart's just answered this one, so I might handball this one to you, Andrew. Is there one key issue or assumption that you think is being overlooked in current coverage?
Well, I think there's a couple of key issues, but I would say, if we're thinking about policy, I think that's like the one thing that we are really missing is a really good debate on policy. What do we actually want to do in this space? And what I mean by that is, well, we're not even 2 months into this shock, and yes, prices have risen very quickly. They could easily come down just as quickly. We do not know. Government doesn't know. Industry doesn't know. No one knows. No one's got a crystal ball. And so what we're doing at the moment is doing short-term policy changes. And we did two already, which is, reducing fuel excise taxes and also using some of our strategic reserves. And you have to question, why did we do that? And I suspect there could be a couple of reasons. We want to smooth volatility because there's adverse economic impacts from high price shocks, and maybe also we think that we're just transitioning to a new steady state of high prices, and we want to smooth that transition. Like that's the only reason you can imagine to put in these short-term policy changes. But generally, we care more about policy with high prices in the medium to long term. Most people can run 30 meters. They don't need help running, for the first 3 months. Like most households will be able to tolerate a very quick and sharp shock of prices. The question is if the price shock is persistent, if it goes into the medium or long term, and then what are the policies that we need to be discussing around that? Not what do we do in the next 3 months, but what do we do if this price level continues for much longer? And I hear a lot of things like, oh, we're going to have to go to a rationing system, and what does that look like? Can a policy like that is just really hard to implement because of what we call information asymmetries or imperfect information. There's actually no really good way of rationing fuel. There's really no good way of rationing fuel. You can come up with various complicated schemes, but there's no perfect way of doing that. And so at the end of the day, you will have to let markets equilibrate, right? So if you've got a constraint, right, and I think this is one thing that we haven't talked about as much, and that's we've got a constraint of fuel. How do we allocate that? Well, we already have a mechanism, and that's the price, right? The price will basically allocate the fuel. And if we want to help in-need consuming households, we shouldn't be trying to fix the energy market and then fix all the other markets. We need to let each of the markets function as designed in a free market economy. And then we do tax and transfer policies to help those in-need households. And we see that in a lot of other countries being done very successfully. And that's the debate we really should be having now, is what types of policies do we expect in the medium and long term? And I think one of the policies I'd really like to see is that we stop trying to put our finger in every single market, trying to change it, and instead say, look, we need to identify these consumers and do tax and transfers directly. And the other policy that's not being brought up is, well, prices aren't really encapsulating all the things that are relevant, and that's basically pointing its finger at a carbon tax. That would be something very smart to basically make prices much more effective at capturing all of the externalities associated with different fuel types. So that's what I think the debate should be around. That's what I think is missing, is what are prices telling us? Let prices equilibrate and actually allocate the fuel. And then if we want to help people, let's do that more directly. Let's not try to fiddle with every single market. So that's, from my perspective, that's what's missing right now. What are we going to do in the short, medium, and long term? And these are the sorts of policies that I'd like to see in that space.
Wonderful. Well, thanks everyone for joining us and for your questions. And thanks especially to our speakers, particularly Andrew, who's joined us super early from Europe this morning. As I said earlier, the recording from the session will be uploaded to the Hub's website as possible. You can see our speakers' contacts here. Please reach out if you have any feedback about this or our earlier briefings. We really want to make sure that they are as useful as they can be. We'll reach out again when we're planning for our next briefing, but do let us know if you have a burning topic that you'd love to see us covered. Thanks, everyone.